Modern people literally panic if the power suddenly goes out and the fridge stops working for even a couple of hours. We start frantically trying to save our dumplings and checking the milk. After all, we've grown so accustomed to comfort that we firmly believe food stays fresh solely thanks to electricity, vacuum-sealed plastic, and scary chemical additives from those long, unpronounceable lists on labels. Now let's go back 1,000 years. Just imagine an ordinary peasant family could leave a hefty piece of meat in a damp cellar for a whole year, survive a harsh winter, and then serve it for dinner without a second thought. To us, that sounds like a guaranteed trip to the hospital with severe food poisoning, doesn't it? Write in the comments right now, would you dare to try a steak that's been sitting for a year? But don't jump to conclusions. Medieval housewives used truly ingenious survival methods. They turned ordinary rock salt, thick smoke, wild honey, vinegar, and melted fat into perfect preservatives that worked better than any modern freezer. And the most amazing thing is, today, these forgotten techniques are suddenly making a comeback in haute cuisine. Be sure to watch this video all the way through because modern science has finally studied these methods and proven their incredible effectiveness. Today, I'll show you the top ancient secrets of food preservation, and one of them will save your supplies even if the whole city loses power for a week. Hit that like button and let's get started. Imagine a world with no freezers, no vacuum-sealed packaging, and not even simple airtight glass jars. The only way to survive the harsh winter was to stock up on enough food as early as the beginning of fall. And the main savior of medieval people in this unequal struggle against looming famine was the most ordinary of substances, salt. Today it costs next to nothing and gathers dust in every kitchen cabinet without us giving it a second thought. But in the Middle Ages, this white powder was so highly prized that it sparked actual bloody wars. Why then was salt so incredibly important for the basic physical survival of entire peoples? The answer lies in simple biology, which ancient people understood solely through trial and error without any microscopes. Bacteria that cause rapid meat decay require liquid moisture to actively multiply. Salt, on the other hand, acts like a tiny but incredibly powerful magnet, drawing absolutely all the water out of the food. Without moisture, microorganisms simply dry out and die, leaving the food completely safe for long-term consumption. Modern scientists call this process osmotic pressure, while medieval peasants simply called it good preparation for winter. The process of proper salting required immense patience and a vast amount of this incredibly valuable resource. To preserve a pork leg for a year, it was literally buried under a thick layer of salt for several long weeks. The meat lost up to a third of its original weight, turning into a dense, almost rock-hard chunk of dehydrated muscle fibers. It didn't look very appetizing, resembling more the worn-out sole of a peasant's boot than a festive delicacy. On the other hand, such food could sit undisturbed in a dark cellar and wait for its time without any artificial refrigeration. Today we do something similar when we buy premium dried fish or expensive Spanish jamón. The only difference is that we eat it for gastronomic pleasure, while they did it solely for survival. Interestingly, absolutely everything that could be found on the farm at the time was subjected to this ruthless salting process. Fish caught during the bountiful summer months were gutted and packed tightly into huge wooden barrels filled with a strong brine solution. In this form, herring could travel on merchant ships for months on end without losing its basic nutritional value. Powerful maritime powers effectively built their thriving economies on this simple technology for preserving caught fish. In essence, salted herring was the medieval equivalent of modern protein bars with an indefinite shelf life. However, salt preservation also had its own significant drawbacks, which historians should not overlook. The constant consumption of such aggressively salty food led to intense thirst, and clean drinking water was extremely scarce. Therefore, medieval people had to wash down such heavy food with enormous quantities of weak beer or homemade ale. This sounds like a modern student's dream, but in reality, it was merely a harsh necessity of life. The low alcohol content killed harmful bacteria in the dirty river water, making the drink relatively safe for the delicate human digestive system. So, expensive salt not only reliably preserved meat, but also indirectly stimulated the rapid development of European brewing. Extracting precious salt in those harsh times was hellish and incredibly dangerous work. In coastal regions, salt was slowly evaporated from seawater, burning entire centuries-old forests to maintain the necessary fire. It is no surprise that this vital product was subject to colossal government taxes in many developed European countries. Recall the famous and cruel salt tax in France, which ultimately became one of the main causes of the Great Revolution. People were willing to rebel desperately and die simply so that their meager food would not rot before spring. Surprisingly, these ancient methods of aggressive salting are once again gaining wild popularity among elite chefs. Expensive Michelin-starred restaurants offer long dry-aged meat, carefully prepared in special Himalayan salt chambers. Wealthy customers pay a fortune for a specific flavor that the average medieval peasant considered a dull part of everyday life. The flavor of such meat becomes more intense, the texture noticeably firmer, and the aroma takes on deep, refined notes. What was once a desperate means of survival in the cold has now become a hallmark of high-end global gastronomy. The next time you casually sprinkle salt on your morning scrambled eggs, just think about the true historical value of these tiny crystals. You are holding in your hands a substance that literally built an entire civilization and saved millions of people from starvation. Without it, long sea voyages and great geographical discoveries would have been physically impossible for humanity. Christopher Columbus's ships would never have been able to cross the vast ocean if there hadn't been salted pork lying in their dark holds. Salt was not just a pleasant seasoning to enhance flavor, it was the primary medieval life insurance policy. And this is just the first of many amazing methods successfully employed by our incredibly resourceful ancestors. While salt mercilessly drew all moisture out of food, thick smoke acted as a veritable chemical attack against bacteria. Medieval peasant homes lacked modern ventilation systems for a long time, so acrid smoke from the hearth often accumulated right beneath the thatched ceiling. Attentive housewives quickly noticed that hams and strings of homemade sausages accidentally hung there, kept significantly longer than usual. This completely accidental domestic discovery eventually became one of the most effective methods of long-term preservation in human history. What we today romantically consider a delicate woody aroma was, back then, literally impenetrable armor against microbes and decay. The process of proper home smoking was a true complex art, requiring deep knowledge of the different species of growing trees. You couldn't just throw the first rotten branch you came across into a burning fire and naively hope for a good, edible result. Coniferous trees always produced too much resin, which made the precious meat unbearably bitter and harmful to a sensitive stomach. Hardwoods like old oak, apple, or sweet cherry were unquestionably considered the ideal choice, producing clean and aromatic smoke. Modern barbecue enthusiasts spend hours studying what any medieval peasant knew perfectly well from early childhood. Smoking techniques were strictly divided into two main popular types: quick cold smoking and slow hot smoking. Hot smoking prepared fresh meat very quickly, but it could be stored for only a few short weeks at best. Classic cold smoking, on the other hand, was an incredibly long, grueling process that often took days or even weeks of continuous work. The smoke temperature never exceeded 30 degrees, so the meat wasn't cooked but slowly dried out and deeply infused with natural preservatives. Fatty pork dried in this complex manner could hang in a dark pantry for years without losing any of its high nutritional value. My jaws start to ache just from the thought of how physically difficult it must have been to chew it later. To eat a piece of such rock-hard smoked meat, it also had to be cooked very long and thoroughly. It was usually thrown into a large boiling pot with vegetable broth and simmered for several hours straight until the tough, dry fibers finally softened. At the same time, this meat generously imparted its rich, smoky aroma to the simple broth, transforming the murky water into an incredibly hearty and delicious dish. It was a truly ingenious way to make economical use of the same product to create completely different flavor profiles in the winter. Today, we lazily buy chemical liquid smoke in small plastic bottles, desperately trying to quickly replicate this complex effect. But there is one very interesting historical issue that many romance enthusiasts often overlook. Living in a cramped house where something was constantly smoldering around the clock was incredibly harmful to one's health. Medieval people breathed this thick, toxic smoke all day long, which inevitably led to severe chronic respiratory diseases. Archaeologists often find ancient peasant remains with lungs that are completely black, like those of modern-day heavy smokers or coal miners. The long-term preservation of food came at too high a cost to the health of the very people who painstakingly prepared and stored it. Surviving the harsh winter demanded constant sacrifices, and often the lungs of these simple laborers became the terrible price they paid. On the other hand, the acrid smoke did an excellent job of dealing with yet another perennial scourge: incredibly annoying insects and rodents. Rats and fat flies genuinely hated the sharp smell of smoked wood, so they always tried to stay away from food supplies. Smoked pork hams hung high near the ceiling were literally out of reach for most hungry small pests. It was a brilliant, comprehensive system of home protection that worked flawlessly on several important fronts at once. Modern, expensive chemical repellents would certainly do well to learn a thing or two about the stunning effectiveness of ordinary smoldering oak chips. It is interesting to note that long-term fish smoking was even more popular than traditional meat smoking. In Old England, for example, herring was smoked on a massive scale until it reached such a rock-hard state that it became as solid as a real wooden plank. People called this unusual fish red herring because of the very distinctive dark color it acquired during the long process. Its smell was so incredibly strong that it instantly threw off even the best hunting dogs, which were confidently following a fresh trail. This is precisely where the well-known English expression red herring originated, referring to a cunning diversionary tactic in detective stories. It turns out that this harsh medieval method of food preservation literally gifted our modern world with a very popular literary term. Smoke has proven its phenomenal reliability over many millennia of the harshest climatic trials. It required absolutely no complex, incomprehensible technologies, expensive rare equipment, or a stable power supply to function without interruption. All that was really needed was a good piece of meat, some suitable firewood, and an intuitive understanding of how to manage a low flame. This is the most basic, fundamental survival skill that allowed our distant ancestors to successfully settle the coldest regions of our vast planet. And although today we have absolutely no need to desperately smoke food to stave off starvation, that taste has remained forever in our genetic memory. However, meat was far from the only food that desperately needed reliable protection from the relentless march of time. When we think of honey in the modern world, we usually picture a sweet, comforting dessert to go with tea or a folk remedy for a sore throat. Sounds rather strange in the context of harsh survival, doesn't it? But in ancient times and the dark Middle Ages, this sticky gold was a powerful preservative capable of keeping organic matter intact for millennia. Archaeologists still periodically find tightly sealed jars of honey in ancient Egyptian tombs, honey that is perfectly safe to eat. More than 3,000 years have passed, and this incredible product hasn't even begun to spoil, ferment, or become covered in dangerous, poisonous mold. But precious honey wasn't just used in the kitchen to create delicious, long-lasting strategic reserves. Hardened military medics applied it directly on the muddy battlefields for emergency treatment of the most severe open wounds. They generously smeared a thick layer of honey onto deep cuts, creating a perfect airtight barrier against the ever-present dirt and deadly infections. It sounds like a rather strange culinary recipe, but it actually saved the limbs of wounded soldiers from inevitable amputation on a massive scale. Honey quickly killed any infection and effectively drew out pus, accelerating the natural healing process of damaged tissues several times over. Modern advanced medicine has once again begun using special types of medical honey in hospitals, finally acknowledging the wisdom of ancient physicians. Preserving raw meat in sweet honey seems to us today like an absolute absurdity and a complete perversion of normal human taste. However, for wealthy Romans and later for powerful medieval lords, it was a clear sign of very high social status. Fresh game was coated with a very thick layer of honey, which completely blocked destructive oxygen from reaching the delicate muscle fibers. The sweet, sticky crust quickly dried, turning into an impenetrable, hard shell, beneath which the expensive meat remained incredibly tender and fresh. During the final cooking, this sweet shell caramelized beautifully, creating a stunning crispy crust that Michelin-starred chefs today are trying so hard to replicate. Harvesting wild honey in those harsh times was an extremely dangerous occupation for strong men with truly nerves of steel. Beekeepers, fearless gatherers of wild honey, deftly climbed tall, ancient trees without any reliable modern safety equipment. They literally pulled full combs out of deep tree hollows with their bare hands, desperately fending off thousands of enraged wild bees. A modern beekeeper's protective suit would have seemed to these rugged people like true magical armor from a distant, bright future. But the reward for this colossal risk was worth it, for high-quality wax and pure honey fetched enormous, fabulous sums of money. The church eagerly bought up tons of wax for endless candles, and the sweet honey quickly found its way to the wealthy castles of local lords. Honey is truly the perfect time capsule, carefully crafted by nature itself to preserve organic life. It requires absolutely no freezing, needs no pasteurization whatsoever, and never spoils at normal room temperature. Little bees worked diligently on this complex chemical formula for millions of years, and they finally succeeded in creating a true masterpiece. Medieval people, knowing absolutely nothing about complex molecular chemistry, were able to make brilliant use of this incredible gift of nature. They simply trusted their eyes, drew conclusions from long observations, and passed this invaluable experience down from generation to generation. But when precious honey was in short supply, a powerful acid entered the scene, which the poor made from the cheapest spoiled wine. Imagine a sharp, acidic liquid capable of easily dissolving a solid pearl, while simultaneously saving ordinary cucumbers from rotting. Pungent vinegar was a true chemical weapon of mass destruction against microbes in the arsenal of any self-respecting medieval housewife. It appeared in homes in a completely natural way when old stocks of wine or weak beer accidentally soured in the heat. Instead of desperately pouring out the spoiled and foul-smelling alcohol, practical people found a truly ingenious use for it. They quickly realized that this aggressive acid was an invisible barrier that no pathogenic bacteria could penetrate. The process of long-term pickling in vinegar elegantly solved two of the most pressing problems facing the average medieval person at once. First, it reliably preserved fresh vegetables harvested during the short summer for the long, dark, and endlessly cold winter months. Ordinary cabbage, carrots, and onions, completely submerged in a harsh, acidic environment, remained crisp, tasty, and absolutely safe to eat. Second, the sharp vinegar radically transformed the very taste of bland foods, adding a bright, invigorating acidity to the very bland winter diet. Without such pickled vegetables, the peasant's daily diet would have consisted exclusively of grey, tasteless porridge and incredibly tough, salty meat. The acid literally and figuratively brought flavour back to life during the darkest, most depressing and coldest times of the year. Diluted vinegar was actively used not only to preserve vegetables, but also for the vital disinfection of dirty drinking water. The rugged Roman legionnaires, and later many medieval travellers, always carried a small travel flask of vinegar with them. It was a simple mixture of water and vinegar that worked wonders for quenching intense thirst and killing off any intestinal infections. Essentially, it was a real-life ancient Gatorade, except it tasted a lot like a strong modern salad dressing. It sounds pretty gross, but it allowed them to drink water from the most dubious puddles without the slightest risk of dying from bloody dysentery. Roman soldiers could calmly continue their long march while their enemies writhed in the bushes from unbearable stomach pain. To make truly high-quality homemade vinegar, you've always needed what's known as a mother of vinegar, a living colony of beneficial bacteria. This dense mass of cellulose and microorganisms looks like a slimy, translucent, and slightly terrifying alien parasite in a jar. Experienced homemakers guarded this strange mother culture like the apple of their eye, and solemnly passed it down to their daughters, along with their recipes. A small piece of this slime was simply tossed into a barrel of leftover ale, and after a couple of weeks, a perfect food preservative was produced. It was a real home biotechnology lab, right in the dirty peasant kitchen, operating without a single interruption or day off. In our modern times, the art of proper fermentation and home pickling is experiencing a true, large-scale renaissance all over the world. Bearded hipsters in trendy leather aprons are ready to spend hours passionately discussing the subtle flavor nuances of homemade apple cider vinegar. They pay top dollar for craft jars of kombucha, which, in its biological essence, is essentially the same as vinegar mother. Expensive restaurants take great pride in their open shelves, densely packed with beautiful jars of pickled vegetables from their own labor-intensive production. What was a grueling daily routine for a weary medieval woman, done for the sake of survival, has today become a very expensive and trendy hobby. People simply instinctively gravitate toward real, living food, having grown thoroughly tired of the uniform, plastic-tasting fare from the nearest supermarket. Vinegar has proven its incredible value 1,000 times over throughout the long and difficult history of human development. It saved entire villages from starvation, treated festering wounds, disinfected murky water, and even protected people from the bubonic plague. And all this amazing versatility came from a product that was originally considered nothing more than hopelessly spoiled sour wine. This is an absolutely perfect historical example of how ancient people were able to masterfully turn a huge problem into a brilliant solution. Acid became a reliable, impenetrable barrier between life and death in the incredibly harsh and brutal world of the early Middle Ages. But when they needed to preserve hearty meat for a truly long time, they turned to the most calorie-dense and labor-intensive method of all. Air is not only what we breathe every day, it is also the greatest enemy of absolutely any fresh food. Along with life-giving oxygen always come microbes, mold spores, and the oxidation process, which mercilessly destroy all winter supplies. Practical people in the Middle Ages realized one truly ingenious thing. If you completely cut off the meat's access to air, it won't spoil. And the best, most reliable, and most accessible insulator at their meager disposal was the most ordinary rendered animal fat. Thus was born an incredibly effective technique, which today, in all the expensive French restaurants, is proudly referred to by the beautiful word confit. The process of creating such a reliable fat capsule was very labor-intensive, but incredibly effective for surviving the harsh winter. Fresh poultry, or fatty pork, was first simmered for a very long time in its own rendered fat over the slowest possible heat. All the water from the muscle fibers completely evaporated, and its place inside the meat was taken by hot, aromatic melted fat. Then these pieces were packed very tightly into deep ceramic pots and covered with a thick layer of that same pure fat. As it solidified in the cold, it formed an absolutely impenetrable white seal, as dense as a concrete slab. No microbe in the world could physically break through this dense barrier deep into the precious pot. Such heavy pots of preserved meat could sit undisturbed in a cool earthen cellar for anywhere from 6 months to a year. Inside this airtight fat tomb, the meat continued to mature very slowly, radically altering its internal chemical structure. Over time, the tough fibers became so tender that they could easily be spread on a slice of bread, like a delicate pâté. The flavor also evolved significantly, acquiring very deep and rich nutty notes that are impossible to achieve with ordinary quick frying. Poor peasants created these culinary masterpieces not out of luxury, but simply out of a desperate attempt to preserve every calorie until spring. In the harsh Middle Ages, calories were the ultimate currency, valued far more than silver or gold. In the cold winter, a person needed a massive amount of thermal energy just to avoid freezing to death in their sleep. Animal fat is the most powerful, concentrated form of energy that could be easily obtained from the surrounding natural world. By eating a small piece of such tender meat along with the fat, a peasant received a tremendous burst of energy for a whole day of hard labor. Modern trendy dietitians would instantly faint at the sight of such a monstrous amount of cholesterol on a single peasant's plate. But for an adult swinging a heavy axe in the bitter cold, it was the absolute ideal sports nutrition. The famous nutritious pemmican, which the Native Americans of North America prepared from dried meat and fat, worked on the same principle. They would grind the dried meat into a fine powder over a long period, mix it with sour berries, and pour boiling melted lard over it. The result was a kind of energy bar that didn't spoil for decades and took up minimal space in a backpack. European explorers of the North very quickly adopted this method from the Native Americans for their long and dangerous polar expeditions. Without this reliable fat-based technology, conquering the North Pole would have been an absolutely impossible task for the frail human body. We have completely forgotten how to appreciate natural fat, mistakenly declaring it the main enemy of the health of the modern sedentary person. For decades, a massive fitness industry has aggressively persuaded us to buy completely fat-free products, which were generously filled with harmful sugar. But ancient people instinctively understood that the right kind of animal fat is vital for the body to function properly. It helps the body absorb essential vitamins, reliably warms the body, and ensures the long-term stable functioning of the human brain. In recent years, popular keto diets have brought fats back into the spotlight, thereby confirming the historical wisdom of our distant ancestors. Science has simply described in very complex and obscure terms what a medieval, uneducated housewife knew purely intuitively. In addition to meat, clarified fat was often used to preserve butter, which would quickly go rancid when exposed to the open air. In Ireland, archaeologists often find wooden barrels containing so-called bog butter, buried there thousands of years ago. Peat bogs created a very cold, stable, and oxygen-free environment, absolutely ideal for preserving delicate dairy products. This ancient butter acquired a very distinct earthy flavor, but miraculously remained perfectly safe to eat. People literally used entire natural bogs as giant, free refrigerators for their most valuable winter provisions. Sealing food from harmful air using animal fat was a truly brilliant engineering solution of the past. It required no complex chemicals at all, just a very basic, rudimentary understanding of the physics behind moisture retention. Melt it, pour it in tightly, let it cool. That's the whole secret behind preserving meat for 1,000 years in the complete absence of electricity. This incredible simplicity and reliability, proven over centuries, made the method absolutely ideal for the harshest living conditions. Fat wasn't just calories. It was an excellent building material for creating impenetrable shields against bacteria. But the most amazing thing about this story is how modern people are rediscovering these methods for themselves. We live in an era of incredible food technology and highly complex global international supply chains. Fresh red strawberries are readily available in January, and exotic ocean fish can be easily delivered by plane within a single day. But this entire vast, complex system is critically dependent on an uninterrupted supply of electricity and very cheap fossil fuels. Should a global power grid failure occur, millions of tons of food would turn into rotting garbage in a matter of days. Our high-tech civilization has created ideal conditions for comfort, but in doing so has left us completely defenseless in the face of crisis. This is precisely why we are seeing such a phenomenal, incredible surge of interest in old methods of survival and food preservation today. people are finally beginning to realize that ancient, primitive technologies possess remarkable resilience against any global catastrophe. A massive movement of preppers, or so-called survivalists, is actively studying and practicing medieval methods of food preservation without electricity. They buy salt by the sack, build homemade smokehouses in their backyards, and are relearning how to pickle vegetables in barrels. It sounds like mild paranoia, but recent global crises have clearly shown that supermarket shelves empty almost instantly. The ability to reliably preserve food without a working refrigerator is once again becoming a critically important skill, not just a fun historical hobby. Moreover, modern science is uncovering more and more hidden drawbacks in contemporary industrial food preservation methods. Artificial chemical additives that keep bread on the shelf from going stale for months are quietly destroying our gut microbiome. Widespread plastic packaging constantly releases microplastics, which scientists are now finding even in the blood and hearts of modern humans. Medieval methods, for all their apparent crudeness and primitiveness, were completely eco-friendly and 100% natural. Common salt, wood smoke, honey, vinegar, and animal fat leave absolutely no toxic waste behind for millennia. The powerful resurgence of interest in home fermentation is yet another confident step backward toward a healthy future. Modern medicine has realized that the live beneficial bacteria in sauerkraut work far better than any artificial vitamins in pills. Regular consumption of naturally fermented foods effectively restores the digestive system, which has been nearly destroyed by modern antibiotics. What our hardy ancestors did solely to survive the winter is now strongly recommended by the best gastroenterologists. Ancient people created a powerful natural remedy entirely by accident, simply by trying to preserve the remnants of the autumn harvest from rotting. It is essentially a free, everlasting pharmacy that is always at hand and requires absolutely no doctor's prescriptions. It is fascinating to observe how quickly professional chefs' attitudes toward these ancient peasant practices are changing. The world's finest restaurants are fiercely competing to see who can create the most complex natural fermentation or the perfect cold smoking technique. Today's hot cuisine laboratories resemble the dark cellars of a medieval alchemist than a sterile modern kitchen. Everywhere, dry-aged hams hang from the ceiling, huge jars of vinegar quietly bubble, and expensive cheeses slowly mature in ashes. Contemporary gastronomy is confidently returning to its historical roots, realizing that cheap industrial food has completely lost its soul. But there is also a very important psychological aspect that perfectly explains the growing popularity of these forgotten practical skills. The modern urbanite is completely detached from the process of food production. They simply buy a ready-made, packaged product at the store. Curing meat or smoking fish for a long time with our own hands restores our lost sense of control over our lives. It is an almost meditative, very soothing process that directly connects us to generations of distant ancestors who did the same thing. A friend of mine once started making salted pork belly just for fun on a boring weekend. Now he has a whole basement full of excellent provisions, and he feels much more confident in the face of any potential crisis. However, we definitely shouldn't romanticize the incredibly harsh and dangerous reality of the Middle Ages. Back then, the slightest mistake in salt proportions or smoke temperature could easily cost an entire peasant family their lives. Deadly botulism was a real and constant threat, lurking silently in poorly prepared homemade preserves. Today, we have highly accurate scales, digital thermometers, and a basic understanding of microbiology for completely safe cooking. We can easily draw on all the centuries-old wisdom of our ancestors, permanently removing the risk of accidental, agonizing death from the equation. A deep understanding of the principles of preservation radically changes our careless attitude toward the enormous amount of food waste. Instead of thoughtlessly throwing away food scraps, people are learning once again to transform them into something completely new. Sour wine quickly becomes excellent homemade vinegar, and all the fat trimmings are rendered down to make delicious meat confit. This saves a tremendous amount of money and significantly reduces the incredible burden on our planet's environment. Medieval peasant frugality is exactly what our modern, spoiled consumer society critically needs. Our ancestors had no idea what the trendy term sustainability meant. They simply couldn't afford to throw anything away. A careful study of the history of everyday life gives us much more than just dry dates of great historical battles. Knowing how people managed to survive in the harshest conditions reveals the true power of the human mind. Without sophisticated technology, well-lit laboratories, or government grants, they found ingenious solutions to the most complex chemical problems. They successfully utilized osmotic pressure, fermentation, and acidic environments centuries before these phenomena were scientifically described. This invariably inspires immense, sincere respect for their powers of observation and their astonishing practical ingenuity. These ancient survival skills have not been completely forgotten. They have simply lain dormant for a long time beneath a thick layer of modern comfort. Now, as our world becomes increasingly unstable and unpredictable, we are turning once again to these time-tested methods. Salt, smoke, honey, vinegar, and fat are once again ready to serve humanity faithfully, just as they did many millennia ago. This is the true, solid foundation of our civilization, one that cannot possibly be replaced by any innovative digital technologies. Knowledge of these incredibly simple methods makes us less dependent on the fragile infrastructure of the modern world. And perhaps it is precisely these old secrets that will one day save our lives again when electricity suddenly disappears. The history of human survival is not just a grandiose tale of steel swords, gleaming armor, and great generals. Above all, it is an endless story of how to outwit nature and preserve food for tomorrow. Medieval housewives were the true genius chemical engineers of their time. Even though they often couldn't even read or write, their incredible methods using salt, smoke, honey, vinegar, and fat have passed the harshest test of all, the test of merciless time. And although today our refrigerators hum quietly, promising eternal freshness, it's very useful to remember that true safety lies in ordinary jars and wooden barrels. After all, any complex technology can suddenly fail, but the basic laws of physics and chemistry will always continue to work.